Across the shattered landscape of Europe, church bells tolled, celebratory gunfire echoed, and banners unfurled, heralding a moment of freedom. For countless individuals, this marked the conclusion of 6 agonizing years of all-consuming conflict. Yet, for a particular cohort of young women gathered in the somber confines of German rail yards, this day held a profoundly different significance. Their attire, the faded vestiges of auxiliary uniforms, was threadbare, their boots were cracked, and their hair remained unwashed after weeks of relentless retreat. Many were scarcely 20 years of age, their countenances still bearing the faint imprints of youth, obscured by layers of soot and profound exhaustion. They were once secretaries, typists, radio operators, and nurses, integral components of a military apparatus that had not only consumed their nation, but had subsequently crumbled into dust in their hands. Now, with the Reich in ruins, they were being herded onto trains, not for a journey home, but for internment. The scene was peculiar. Lines of women in their gray-green skirts and jackets, hauling battered luggage, boarding the dark, wooden freight cars that had once transported troops to the front lines. Some clutched rosaries, others tightly held ration tins, and some possessed nothing at all. A young woman from Hamburg confided in her companion, her voice barely a whisper, "The Americans will show us no mercy. They will make an example of us." This fear had been instilled in her by a Luftwaffe officer during the tumultuous surrender. Another, taller woman, hardened by years spent manning anti-aircraft searchlights, remained silent, her jaw set as if steeling herself for a physical blow. They had been repeatedly told that the Allied forces, particularly the Americans, were not men but predatory beasts, and that captivity would inevitably bring degradation, brutality, and perhaps something far worse. The trains began their westward journey, traversing a panorama of devastation. Charred remnants of towns drifted past like spectral apparitions. Churches stood headless, their spires absent. Bridges lay contorted into rivers, and skeletal factories still exhaled wisps of smoke. Children, their faces as thin as paper, waved from the embankments. During the night, when the train halted, the women would huddle together for warmth, listening to the measured tread of the guards' boots outside and the sporadic crackle of distant gunfire. Anna, a former secretary from Munich, managed to preserve a small diary and recorded her thoughts. "We are being taken to a distant place. No one knows where. My mother will believe I am deceased. Perhaps I will be." Their journey did not conclude in a German detention facility, but rather amidst the disarray of occupied ports like Bremen, Le Havre, and Cherbourg, where vessels lay anchored beneath the American flag. The women were marched onto the gangplanks, passing soldiers whose expressions they struggled to decipher. Some conveyed curiosity, others an almost palpable indifference. They had braced themselves for snarling, insults, and blows. Instead, they encountered an unnerving sense of order, extensive paperwork, and meticulously formed lines. They were catalogued, tagged, and then divided into groups. It felt less like retribution and more like a disorienting administrative process. Nevertheless, as the ship's engines stirred to life and the European coastline receded, a profound dread began to permeate their beings. The vast, unbroken expanse of the Atlantic lay before them, and America, a distant, enigmatic land of myth and enemy caricature, awaited on the opposite shore. On board, seasickness afflicted many. The bunks were stacked within steel holds, the air thick with the brine of the sea and the acrid fumes of diesel. Meals were dispensed on trays, featuring pallid bread, substantial slabs of meat, and steaming mugs of coffee. The women stared in sheer disbelief. For years, their sustenance had consisted of cabbage stalks, coarse bread concocted from sawdust and barley, and thin soup ladled from rusted cans. Some hesitated to consume the food, suspecting it might be poisoned. Others devoured it with avidity, tears coursing down their faces at the unadulterated taste of real bread. "They are feeding us as if we were their own," one woman whispered, her voice laced with astonishment. It was not compassion they had anticipated, it was punishment. Yet this reality, so contrary to their expectations, unsettled them more deeply than any act of cruelty could have. Upon finally reaching American soil, New York, Boston, New Orleans, the women congregated on deck, their hands gripping the railings, their gazes fixed on skylines that bore no scars of aerial bombardment. The Statue of Liberty loomed, an ironic monument that elicited no smiles. Crowds lined the piers, some jeering, others merely observing. The women were escorted ashore under guard, their boots echoing on the wooden planks. The air carried a different scent, cleaner, more invigorating, tinged with the ocean's salt, but untainted by the ashes of war. For the first time, some truly grasped the totality of their world's collapse. Germany was a wasteland of rubble. America, in stark contrast, stood intact, prosperous, and vibrantly alive. Buses and trains conveyed them inland to encampments established across the United States, including Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, Camp Ruston in Louisiana, and numerous others. The roads unspooled before them, bordered by verdant fields and towns where children rode bicycles and houses gleamed with pristine white porches. For women who had witnessed their own cities reduced to infernos by Allied bombs, this spectacle was almost incomprehensible. They exchanged hushed whispers amongst themselves. Could this truly be the land of the monsters? Could such an abundance be genuine? Their own Reich had promised triumph and delivered only desolation. The adversary they had been conditioned to despise seemed to inhabit an entirely different dimension. At the gates of the camps, their names were duly recorded, their possessions meticulously catalogued, and their uniforms exchanged for simple civilian attire. However, before they could settle into their new surroundings, one final step remained. The guards, firm yet devoid of brutality, directed them toward a specific building. Inside, the hiss of steam and the drip of water created an unnerving symphony. It was the delousing station, though the women were unaware of its purpose. Their hearts pounded with apprehension. This, they feared, could be the moment of humiliation, degradation, the very cruelty they had been warned about. In the lengthy queue, anxious whispers circulated. "This is where they will make us suffer." One woman clutched her suitcase as if it were a shield. Another silently made the sign of the cross. The line advanced at a glacial pace, and as each woman entered the tiled room, her expectations were irrevocably confronted by reality. They were presented with bars of soap, real soap, thick, white, and substantial in their hands, emitting a faint floral fragrance. Towels followed, and then clean garments. The showers unleashed torrents of hot water, washing away months of accumulated grime. Some women openly wept, their sobs echoing off the tiles. Others emitted nervous laughter, unable to fully comprehend the experience. For the first time in years, they felt clean, their hair free of lice, their skin rid of dirt. It was not humiliation, but a profound restoration, an experience that shook them to their very core. That night, Anna once again took up her diary, her handwriting trembling across the page. We were told we would be beaten, mocked, broken. Instead, we were given soap. How can this be? She had yet to grasp that this moment, this simple act of cleansing, would remain imprinted in her memory more indelibly than the war itself. That night, the women lay in their bunks, their hair still damp from the showers, enveloped in blankets that carried the faint scent of starch and cotton. Outside the barracks, the American night hummed with the chirping of crickets, a stark contrast to the thunderous roar of guns. They conversed in hushed, urgent tones, as if sharing a secret too fragile to be spoken aloud. Perhaps the enemy was not as they had been led to believe. Perhaps there existed something here that neither propaganda nor fear could adequately explain. What awaited them in the ensuing days? Sustenance, labor, encounters with Americans that would continue to astonish them. For now, however, a single image lingered in every mind, the soap in their hands, slippery, fragrant, and absurdly gentle. It was merely the commencement of their confinement, yet it already felt like the dawn of something entirely new. And as the sun broke over the camp, a question settled amongst them, as pervasive as the morning mist. If the enemy could exhibit such unexpected humanity, what other surprises lay in store? Buses glided through gates crowned with barbed wire, their engines rumbling as clouds of pale dust rose along the camp road. To the women inside, the scene was both ominous and strangely regimented. Guard towers stood sentinel at intervals. Soldiers lounged with rifles casually slung, and rows of barracks stretched in neat lines across the fields. This was not the grim austerity of a concentration camp. It was something bewilderingly different. The wooden structures were painted, the pathways swept clean, and the fences, while intact, did not convey menace. The prisoners exchanged silent glances, an unspoken question passing between them. Into what world have we stepped? As they disembarked from the bus, each woman received a numbered tag. American officers moved with brisk efficiency, scribbling notes and stamping documents. The women stiffened, anticipating harsh words or severe commands. Yet, the guards spoke with a calm demeanor, their English accents softened by Southern drawls or Midwestern inflections. For many, the initial shock stemmed not from cruelty, but from a pervasive indifference. The Americans treated them not as monsters, nor as honored guests, but as something remarkably ordinary, prisoners of war to be managed, catalogued, and housed. The delousing station had already unsettled them with its unexpected civility, but what followed was even more perplexing. After their showers, they were led into a mess hall. The long room exuded the aroma of coffee, freshly baked bread, and something frying in grease. The women froze at the entrance, disoriented by the sheer olfactory assault alone. Tables stretched across the hall, laden with trays of food, boiled potatoes, carrots, beef stew, and soft rolls glistening with butter. Steam fogged the windows. The scent was rich and overwhelming, an abundance that felt like an assault. One of the guards gestured them forward. Reluctantly, they approached the counter. A cook in a white apron ladled stew onto tin plates, slid slices of bread across, and filled mugs with coffee. The women accepted the trays as if handling volatile explosives. Some avoided the cook's gaze, while others stared at the food, uncertain of its reality. In Germany, the final winter of the war had reduced meals to meager portions of black bread made with sawdust, watery turnip soup, and perhaps a sliver of horse meat, if one was fortunate. Now, in the enemy's camp, they were presented with more food in a single meal than they had seen in weeks. Anna, her diary safely tucked beneath her mattress, sat with her tray at the long table. She dipped her spoon into the stew, observing the grease floating on the surface, the glistening chunks of meat. Tentatively, she tasted it. Her eyes widened, and she pressed a hand to her mouth as if overcome with shame. Around her, other women hesitated, then began to eat in silence, broken only by the gentle scrape of cutlery. For some, tears streamed down their cheeks. One whispered, "My brothers starved in the snow, and here they feed us like this." It wasn't kindness their own leaders had promised them, but humiliation. And yet, the humiliation never materialized. There were no taunts, no jeering. The guards patrolled slowly, observing them with professional detachment. One young soldier, scarcely older than the women themselves, even offered a faint, crooked smile as he passed, as if to offer reassurance. The prisoners were utterly unprepared for such contradictions. They had braced themselves for cruelty, but this quiet civility was, in its own way, far more unsettling. In the days that followed, life within the camp revealed further astonishments. Each morning, they were awakened by a bell, served breakfast, and assigned light duties. Some worked in the kitchens, others in nearby fields, and some in the laundries, where American uniforms were scrubbed and pressed. They were compensated with small wages in camp script, a currency usable at the canteen. There, on wooden shelves, lay chocolates, cigarettes, pencils, even tubes of lipstick. The women stood before these items as if before an altar. A bar of chocolate was a miracle. A tube of lipstick, an unthinkable luxury. Yet here, the enemy offered them in exchange for labor. The irony was almost cruel. Back in Germany, their families scavenged for scraps. Cities lay in ruins. Children sifted through rubble for crumbs. Letters trickled in from home, if they arrived at all, filled with despair. One woman read aloud by candlelight. "We are living in the cellar now, our house above destroyed. We boil weeds for soup. If you have anything, please send it." She folded the paper with trembling fingers, knowing she could not send sustenance back, only words. The chasm between their suffering homeland and the camp's peculiar abundance widened with each passing day. Some began to experience a shame that felt heavier than chains. They were declared enemies, yet here they were, provided with food, clothing, and shelter. The Reich had demanded their unwavering loyalty, dispatching them to operate radios and man spotlights, only to reward them with hunger and devastation. America, their sworn adversary, offered them soap and stew. This stark inversion resonated within their souls, an unspoken but ever-present paradox. At night, They lay awake, listening to the crickets outside the barracks and pondering its meaning. Not everyone adjusted easily. A few resisted, refusing to eat, hoarding bread crusts beneath their pillows, convinced the generosity was a ruse. Rumors circulated that the food might be drugged, that the soap contained some hidden poison. Yet, day after day, nothing untoward occurred beyond the quiet routine of camp life. Their bodies grew healthier, their skin cleared, and the lice vanished. Slowly, suspicion yielded to a reluctant acceptance. The Americans, too, observed with curiosity. Many guards had never encountered German women before, having only seen caricatures and propaganda. They were surprised to find them thin, exhausted, and often frightened. Some were scarcely older than their own sisters back home. One guard wrote in a letter, "They are not what we were told. They are girls, and they look at us as if awaiting a blow that never comes." And so, the conflict deepened, not one of armaments and trenches, but of perception. The women were compelled to reconcile the enemy they had envisioned with the reality before them. Each bite of bread, each bar of soap, each neutral word from a guard chipped away at the image they had been taught to believe. The war had ended, but in their minds, another battle had commenced. A battle between memory and reality, propaganda and truth. Anna captured it in her diary with poignant clarity. To be treated with dignity by those we were told were beasts. It is harder than hatred. Hatred is simple. Dignity is unbearable. Her words resonated with many. The women no longer feared being broken by cruelty. They feared being undone by kindness. One evening, after a day's work in the fields, the women were marched back to camp as the sun descended, casting a golden hue across the horizon. The sky was immense, unmarked by smoke, and the air carried the scent of freshly cut grass. It was a simple scene, yet it weighed upon them more heavily than the ruins of their homeland. Here was a land untouched, abundant, vibrant. The Reich had disintegrated into rubble. America stood unscathed, and in that realization, a new form of unease began to take root. They had weathered the initial shock, the soap, the showers, the food. But something else was dawning, something more challenging to confront, for in the days ahead, it would not be physical survival that tested them, but the slow, unsettling recognition that the enemy might be far more human and far more formidable than they had ever imagined. The weeks settled into a rhythm, and within that rhythm, the women began to lose track of time. Morning bell, breakfast line, work detail, supper, lights out. Yet, beneath the surface of this routine, a peculiar transformation began to stir. Initially, they had counted days like prisoners scratching tally marks into stone, but gradually, the sharp edge of captivity dulled, replaced by a quiet bewilderment. They were prisoners, undeniably, but they were also fed, clothed, and even compensated. A stark contrast for women raised in a collapsing Reich, where loyalty was often met with hunger. This inversion resonated in their thoughts more persistently than any barbed wire fence. Anna, who had once sat in a Munich office typing directives she never questioned, now worked in the camp laundry. The scent of starch and soap clung to her fingers as she smoothed American uniforms. Each shirt bore the initials of men who were her sworn enemies. Yet, as she folded them neatly into piles, she felt not hatred, but an odd, guilt-ridden relief. Here was work that did not involve warfare, work that sustained her life. Sometimes she caught her own reflection in the polished steel of the washing drums and wondered who she was becoming. Others were dispatched to work in the fields under guard, harvesting crops that fed both prisoners and soldiers. They felt the sun on their backs, the dirt beneath their nails, and the startling weight of full baskets. Some even laughed softly at their own sweat, finding in the labor a tangible connection to the villages they had left behind. In the evenings, they returned to the camp, their muscles aching, their spirits strangely lighter. This was not the degradation they had steeled themselves for. This was something entirely different. The camp canteen soon became the most perplexing corner of their new reality. With their wages, small slips of camp script, they could purchase chocolate bars, cigarettes, even jars of jam. The first time Anna bit into a Hershey bar, the sweetness exploded on her tongue like nothing she had tasted since childhood. Tears pricked her eyes, and she turned away from the others, ashamed of her own joy. A young woman from Bremen smeared lipstick on her lips, gazing at herself in a small mirror with disbelief. "I feel human again," she murmured, as if confessing a transgression. Yet, the abundance brought its own form of torment. Letters from home continued to arrive, smuggled through censors, their words etched with desperation. Families wrote of bombed-out apartments, of children coughing in cellars, of bread lines stretching into the frigid cold. One woman read aloud her mother's plea, "If only we had your American bread. Our brother is starving." Silence descended heavily, broken only by the scratching of rats beneath the barracks floorboards. The women sat clutching their letters, their trays of food untouched, the shame of their plenty burning in their throats. The Americans also noted this paradox. Some guards expressed surprise at the German women gaining weight in captivity, their cheeks filling out, their hair regaining its luster. "They're better fed than some folks back home in certain towns," one soldier muttered, a sentiment tinged with half resentment, half wonder. Nevertheless, rules were rules. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners were to be treated according to standards that often surpassed those in war-torn Europe. The irony was not lost on anyone. Still, suspicion never fully dissipated. At night, whispers drifted through the bunks. What if this was all an elaborate charade? What if tomorrow the masks were removed and the cruelty began? A handful clung to their distrust, hoarding bread crusts beneath their mattresses, convinced the generosity was a trap. Yet, as weeks turned into months, even the most cautious were worn down by the relentless, orderly routine of American administration. No beatings occurred, no punishments beyond the dull monotony of labor. The greatest cruelty, it seemed, was to be treated with basic decency. Anna's diary meticulously chronicled this internal conflict. "I eat, and my stomach gives thanks. I sleep, and my body grows strong. Yet each act of kindness cuts me deeper. How can I reconcile this with the faces of children in Munich who drink water for supper?" Her words gave voice to the invisible war now raging in many hearts. To be brutalized would have been simpler. To be treated with dignity by the enemy was an unbearable paradox. Amidst this internal turmoil, small interactions with Americans amplified the contradictions. One evening, a young guard dropped his flashlight during roll call. Anna instinctively bent down, retrieved it, and handed it back. Their fingers brushed, and for a fleeting moment, their eyes met. He gave a quiet nod, nothing more, but the encounter lingered in her thoughts for days. Another time, a soldier passing by the laundry hummed a tune, soft, rhythmic, unmistakably American. A girl from Cologne recognized the melody, let out a soft laugh, and began humming along. For a brief instant, two perceived enemies shared a song across a divide that the war had declared unbridgeable. Not all guards were amiable. Some regarded the women with open disdain, their gazes sharp with grief for brothers lost in Europe. Yet, even their animosity rarely escalated into tangible action. The women were not free, but neither were they subjected to brutality. They existed in a liminal state, suspended between punishment and reprieve. This uncertainty left them restless, uneasy, unable to anchor themselves in the comforting certainty of hatred. And then came the day they were taken outside the confines of the camp for work detail in nearby towns. The ladies journeyed in open-top vehicles through the city streets, their gazes wide with wonder at the shop displays overflowing with merchandise in their pristine windows. Youngsters merrily rolled hoops along the pavements, while gentlemen leisurely perused their newspapers on front porches, blissfully untouched by the ravages of war. They inhaled the delightful aroma wafting from bakeries, and observed neat rows of automobiles gleaming brilliantly under the sun. Movie advertisements were boldly affixed to the brick facades of buildings. For these women, whose most recent recollections of Germany were of shattered streets and the blackened remains of buildings, this scene was profoundly overwhelming. America was not merely standing, it was thriving. That evening, back at their accommodation, a hushed excitement filled the dormitories. Whispers circulated, "Did you see the automobiles? And the bread?" It was so white. The homes were completely intact. For some, the sheer abundance of America was an exhilarating sensation. For others, it served as an unbearable testament to Germany's downfall. The very regime that had promised them vast dominion had left them only desolation. The adversary, it seemed, had provided a world of plenty. This was a truth too immense to readily accept, too sharp to disregard. The struggle, once external, now turned inward. Within their hearts, allegiance warred with reality, pride with thankfulness, and animosity with a reluctant sense of respect. It was not a confrontation of armies, but a gradual erosion of deeply held convictions. Every sliver of chocolate, every warm shower, every glimpse of an undamaged American thoroughfare chipped away at the edifice of indoctrination. The women began to grasp that their homeland had not only deceived them, but had also distorted their very perception of the world. As the chirping of crickets could be heard beyond the perimeter fence, and the camp lights cast a soft glow resembling distant moons, Anna lay awake, her eyes fixed on the ceiling beams. She thought of her family back in Munich, her mother likely boiling weeds for their evening meal, and the pile of debris where her office once stood. She also recalled the slight nod from 2 American guards, the sweet melting of chocolate on her tongue, and the cleansing stream of water cascading down her back. An immense chasm lay between these contrasting images, a gap she could not yet bridge. Yet, deep within her, she sensed a profound and irreversible internal shift. As another sunrise painted the barbed wire in hues of gold, the women understood that mere survival was no longer their sole concern. The true challenge lay in confronting what their confinement had revealed about their adversaries, their homeland, and themselves. Golden autumn leaves, crisp and dry, swirled across the campgrounds, carried by the gentle breeze. The season had changed, though time within the enclosed area felt strangely indefinite, its passage marked not by the ticking of a clock, but by the predictable rhythm of mealtimes, assigned tasks, and correspondence from home. Nevertheless, beneath this established routine, a significant transformation had begun to take root. For months, the women had grappled with the astonishing reality of their survival in America, their days punctuated by the availability of soap, bread, and bewildering acts of civility. But now arrived the more challenging introspection, the contemplation of what all of this signified for their past identities and their future potential. One evening, Anna sat on the steps of the barracks, a journal resting on her lap. She wrote by the dwindling light, her words possessing a newfound sharpness, as if she could no longer contain the internal turmoil that raged within her. "I have consumed more during my confinement than throughout all the years of the Reich," she penned. "I have slept without the dread of air raids, yet my spirit finds no solace. What manner of world is this where the enemy exhibits greater grace than our own?" Her handwriting grew unsteady. She paused, hearing the sound of laughter from a nearby cluster of women. They were sharing small pieces of candy, playfully discussing shades of lipstick, their voices as cheerful as if the war had never touched them. Anna felt a pang of envy, unable to join their light-hearted exchange. The weight of her allegiance to her shattered nation pressed down upon her, even as it seemed to slip through her grasp. Meanwhile, the American personnel gradually grew accustomed to their unexpected captives. Some of the guards began to perceive them less as embodiments of an enemy regime and more as individuals, fragile, persistent, confused, and occasionally exhibiting a certain charm in their hesitant attempts at English. A few guards even shared cigarettes, passing them wordlessly across the fence, a gesture that transcended mere politics, speaking instead to shared humanity. However, for every instance of quiet compassion, an inherent distance persisted. They remained the adversaries, still imprisoned, a constant reminder of lives extinguished across the ocean. The camp was never entirely free of underlying tension, its severity merely softened by the predictability of daily life. It was, however, beyond the perimeter fence that the most profound revelations unfolded. With increasing frequency, the women were dispatched to American towns for labor, always under escort, yet with far more autonomy than they had ever anticipated. They toiled in cotton fields, worked in canning factories, or assisted in the upkeep of public parks. The local inhabitants observed them with a mixture of curiosity, sometimes aloofness, sometimes warmth, and at other times, sheer indifference. Children openly gawked, pointing at the German girls, while shopkeepers observed from their doorways. Yet, what resonated most deeply with the women was not outright hostility, but the pervasive sense of normalcy. American life proceeded without interruption. Movie theaters illuminated their marquees. Grocery stores displayed shelves laden with an abundance of goods. Radios broadcast lively jazz music and live baseball game commentaries. For 4 women from cities where rubble had replaced once grand boulevards, the sight was almost too much to bear. One afternoon, after several hours of strenuous harvesting, Anna's group was provided with lunch in a local church hall by community volunteers. The tables were laden with an impressive spread of sandwiches, fruits, and pies. The women hesitated, their hands hovering, as if fearful that the bounty might vanish. An elderly American woman, her apron lightly dusted with flour, gently encouraged them. "Eat, please eat." Anna bit into an apple, its crispness and sweetness almost bringing her to tears. She had not tasted fruit since 1942. Across the table, another prisoner whispered, "This is paradise." But Anna merely gazed at the white flesh of the apple, her mother's voice echoing in her memory. Save the peel for soup. The stark contrast threatened to break her. That night, back in the barracks, conversations grew more somber. They spoke of home, of families enduring in basements, of children with bare feet in the snow, of brothers lost on the Eastern Front. Some began to articulate what had long been an unspoken fear, that their nation might have deceived them, sacrificing them not for glory, but for utter annihilation. "We were taught they were beasts," murmured one woman, her gaze fixed on her blanket. "But who are the beasts now? Those who destroyed our homes, or those who constructed this world of plenty?" No one offered a reply. The silence carried a weight far greater than any spoken word. Yet, guilt was not their sole burden. Gratitude, too, proved unsettling. They were prisoners, undeniably, but they were alive, clean, and well-fed. They had anticipated being stripped of all dignity. Instead, they had been shown more kindness than they dared to imagine. The soap, the showers, the chocolate, all were symbolic of something larger, something more difficult to define. Was it an act of compassion, or perhaps hypocrisy? Or was it simply a reflection of the fact that the Americans adhered to principles the Reich had long abandoned? Each woman wrestled with these questions in solitude, unable to find definitive answers, yet equally unable to dismiss them. Anna's journal evolved into a testament to this internal struggle. "It would be simpler to harbor hatred," she wrote. "Hatred serves as a fortress, shielding us from the outside world. But what they offer us, the bread, the soap, the music, it penetrates those defenses. It compels us to acknowledge their humanity. And if they are indeed human, then what becomes of all the bloodshed, all the devastation, all the falsehoods we have embraced?" She closed her journal one evening, her chest tight with a feeling akin to betrayal, unable to commit further thoughts to paper. The guards, too, sensed the subtle but significant shift. They observed their charges laughing at American films screened in makeshift camp theaters, saw them attempt to sing along, however imperfectly but with genuine earnestness, to songs emanating from the radio. This display was both disarming and unsettling. One sergeant remarked to another, "You could almost forget they were the enemy for a moment, if not for their uniforms." This observation held a note of caution as much as one of surprise. The war had necessitated clear distinctions. Life, however, was blurring those lines. The most profound revelation, however, was not derived from the food, the work, or the fleeting glimpses of American streets, but from their own reflections. The women's physical appearances began to change. Their faces filled out, their hair regained its luster, and color returned to their cheeks. Some even appeared younger, as though their confinement had somehow reversed the aging process brought on by the war. To witness this restoration of their own appearance was almost unbearable. It forced them to confront the profound failure of the Reich. Their adversaries had nurtured their health, while their own nation had condemned them to starvation. This was not merely a discovery, it was a damning indictment. Yet, even as they adapted, even as laughter began to return, an undercurrent of unease persisted, for they understood that their captivity could not endure indefinitely. One day they would be sent back to Germany, to a landscape of ruins, to families steeped in despair. The prospect of trading abundance for hunger once more, of exchanging cleansing soap for the pervasive soot of destruction, filled them with apprehension. More than one woman whispered in the darkness, "I am afraid to return." It was a sentiment bordering on treason to admit, yet it was undeniably true. As winter approached, rumors circulated about impending transfers, about repatriation, about journeys eastward. These whispers filled the barracks with a palpable sense of dread. What awaited them in the devastated remnants of their homeland? Would their families even recognize them, healthy and clean, their cheeks flushed with the vitality of their captivity? Some dreaded the judgment they perceived in their mothers' eyes, the silent accusation that they had lived in comfort while others endured hardship. Anna, once again gazing at her journal, penned words she had never dared to express before. "I feared leaving more than I feared arriving." The confession sent a chill through her, but it was honest, for the enemy's most potent weapon had not been their armaments. It had been soap, sustenance, and a measure of dignity. And these things had accomplished what animosity could not. They had changed her. One morning, as Frost delicately traced patterns on the camp fences, the announcement arrived. A transport would be departing soon. The women gathered in a close huddle, their hearts pounding, their eyes wide with unspoken questions. To return meant confronting hunger, devastation, and the specter of all they had once believed. To remain meant continued confinement, but also the continuation of life. The guards read out the names from a list, their voices devoid of emotion. But to the women, each syllable landed with the force of a thunderclap. And as Anna heard her name called, as she stepped forward into the crisp morning air, she realized the true conflict was no longer between nations. It resided within her, in the very space where hatred had once resided and where something new, fragile, perilous, and undeniable had begun to take root.